Economy has arrived. The world is teeming with innovation as new business models reinvent every industry. InsideAnalysis is your source of information and insight about how to make the most of this exciting new era. Learn more at InsideAnalysis.com.
InsideAnalysis.com.
And now, here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
Oh, yes, folks. Hello and welcome back once again to the only coast-to-coast radio show that's all about the information economy. It's yours truly, Eric Kavanaugh on Inside Analysis. And we're going to talk today about a very interesting partnership between two companies, CrimsonLogic and Mastercard, all about payments and the payments industry, making it easier to deal with fees that you have to pay the government, maybe for your passport or maybe for some report that you want or whatever you want to do, basically just making it easier. So we'll be talking to Melvin Xavier from CrimsonLogic, and our good buddy Eugene Burke from Digital Strategies Group is here as well. He's got a lot of experience in the banking industry. So we'll talk about that, and I'll just say a couple words up front. It's really fun to watch the innovation in the fintech space. There is tremendous innovation, and that's good for the consumers. I used to work at a bank in 1988, I think. No, it's longer than that. 1985 and 86, I worked at a bank. I can still remember the keystrokes: black 5, red T, now account, enter, put in the account number, and take the money out, et cetera. I've done the whole thing. And way back then, I mean, it cost money to go check your balance, for example. I mean, there were fees that were associated with everything, transferring money. Think about Western Union, right? They made a lot of their money transferring money from one place to another, and they took a little service charge, $25, $20, whatever it was. Well, now with Venmo or Zelle or any number of other systems, you could just bing, send money instantaneously. Now, under the hood, there are a bunch of different things that have to happen to make sure that's all done correctly. And that's one thing I do love about the tech space in financial services is you got to be bulletproof. I mean, banks are not known to lose money. Everyone who's played Monopoly knows that fun card, bank error in your favor, collect like $200 or something. That doesn't happen very often. Banks don't make that mistake very often. And when they do make mistakes, well, as long as you got an audit trail, you can track it down. But the payments space is white hot. There are lots of great things you can do these days much more easily than you used to be able to do. And like I say, that's good for consumers. It's good for everyone. And in this new partnership, CrimsonLogic, based in Singapore, I do believe, is partnering up with Mastercard, and they're going to really do some very clever work around integrating these environments and making it much easier to pay for government services and much easier for the governments to track where the money came from, who spent it on what, and all these fun things to make sure they're doing their jobs. So with that, let me bring in Melvin Xavier from CrimsonLogic. Melvin, welcome to the show. Thanks for dialing in at 4 o'clock in the morning, your time. You're a dedicated consultant out there. Tell us a bit about yourself and CrimsonLogic and what this partnership is all about.
All right. Thanks, Eric, for having me here for this show. Well, my name is CrimsonLogic. I work in Singapore. This is where our headquarters is. We are a company which was started in the year 1988. We have about 35 years of experience digitally transforming government organizations worldwide. Our home base is in Singapore. We do quite a lot of work for the Singapore government, but that doesn't stop us here. We have expanded globally. We have offices in over 20 countries. We have done projects across 40 countries. Most of them are nationwide critical systems, starting from trade to government to judiciary and so on. So with this new partnership that we have with Mastercard, we are hoping to take the government services, which involves in payments, collections, disbursements of subsidies, to the next level. So in terms of government being able to pay the members of the public who are beneficiaries of certain schemes, giving the ability for the members of the public to be able to have a single platform where they would be able to see all the subsidy programs that are available, allowing the government to evaluate all the applications that they receive from the members, and also to have some sort of automated capabilities to allocate funds and then subsequently the actual disbursement itself. And government money, which is given to people, have certain TNCs that people are supposed to adhere to. So that's where MasterCard comes in. They allow the people to take the money out, spend the money for what it is to be spent for, provide the ability for the governments to track the funding, track the spending, and then it goes back into the system. It's a feedback loop. So the government goes back into their analysis to figure out whether they have done the right job, whether people who are in need have got the money. So that's more from the disbursement angle. From the payment angle, again, governments want to simplify the payments for the services that we subscribe from the government. It could be utilities, it could be public services, civic services. So this capability that we have with MasterCard allows the governments as well as the members of the public to have one single suite of systems integrated together and offered to them.
Yeah, and that single source of truth, if you will, that's very powerful. It's good both for the consumers and also for the government to have a marshaling area where all the information is going to be processed and stored. So from the consumer perspective, it's easy to come in, get to the services that you're looking for, be able to quickly apply, put in whatever information is necessary, and then fairly easily get your money, right? I'm sure they probably connect their checking accounts or some other kind of account to that system. And then from the government side, it's great to have a partner like MasterCard that can pull all this data together. I'm guessing it's delivered mostly by API. And so again, you have a nice clean audit trail. And it's also very good, which you were kind of implying, for reporting and analysis, right? To be able to do some analysis of the data and understand, did things work the way we wanted them to work? Are we getting the people the right money they're supposed to get? All that kind of fun stuff is really enabled by this kind of very tight partnership, right?
Right. You're right. It also addresses the unbanked population in many of the developing countries where with this partnership, people really don't have to go and apply for a bank account and then come back to the government, declare that this is my bank account. And it also avoids people from misusing the capabilities and facilities that are provided by the government. One beneficiary doesn't get benefited from two different schemes, which are not supposed to be availed at the time. So there are many revenue leakage, subsidy leakage prevention that can be put in place with this consolidated platform.
Well, and you're picking up on something that was a really big deal here in the United States, especially California, but also I'm sure other countries too, which was COVID relief money. And apparently there were just a tremendous number of bad actors jumping on the bandwagon and siphoning off millions, I think tens of millions of dollars in the case of California. And a solution like what you are working on with MasterCard and the government of Singapore and other governments really addresses that, right? So it gives you a safeguard, so you at least have, another essentially wall of security around the money to make sure, hey, is this person who they say they are? Should we really be giving this money? I'm talking, I think it was tens of millions of dollars. I'll look it up while we're on this call today. But that's a nice value add for the government and for the taxpayers too, right? Because when people rip off the government, they basically rip off every single person who paid taxes to that government. What do you think?
That's exactly right. So it's all about being able to deliver the support for the right individuals who are qualified. So there's, as you rightly pointed out, the issue is with the disbursement side as well, right? So when the money is there with the government, when there's a fund allocated by the federal or the local or the state, the governments usually struggle in determining who needs to basically be paid and how much is that amount that needs to be paid. So there's a lot of paperwork that needs to go in, which also kind of red tapes this whole process. People are not able to get the money on the right time. They have to probably queue up and apply for it online and wait for days and months to get the money. So this entire integrated platform actually solves few problems. Problem number one could be the visibility, accessibility, getting to know what services are available for the members of the public to subscribe to. So the problem number two could be the government being able to evaluate test whether the means and merits are in place for people to avail these benefits. 3 is the disbursement. 4 is the control on the disbursed money, whether they are using this money for the right reasons. If it's given for buying stationery for children who go to school and universities, are they being actually used to buy stationery? So MasterCard comes in with their powerful network of payment terminals across the world, where they can potentially block card payments which have subsidy money inside from being misused, and then subsequently, again, as I said previously, it goes back into the feedback loop, where the government can actually evaluate whether the money is being spent for the right reasons or not.
Yeah, that's right. Well, let me bring in Eugene Burke from Digital Strategies Group to comment on this. And I just looked it up quickly. It was $30 billion. So tens of billions of dollars,
Billions.
not
Yes.
tens of millions, billions. So a million times 1,000 is a billion. And we're talking 10. It's embarrassing, honestly, to lose that much money. And like I say, every taxpayer feels that, and to some small degree. But Eugene, you've got a lot of experience in the banking world, so you know the rigor necessary to put together solutions, the security hurdles to clear, architectural hurdles to clear. You have to dot every single I, cross every single T, and be very patient, right?
You do. And it's interesting that the MasterCard network is a very, very highly developed, mature payments network. So I'm curious, in the 3 areas that you outlined, so visibility to the services, eligibility testing, and disbursement monitoring, the second and third are interesting, that Crimson is bringing capabilities to MasterCard that they found really attractive. Can you elaborate on a capability either in eligibility testing or disbursement monitoring that you're adding to the Microsoft network, or not the MasterCard network?
All right. So when at the time of crisis, let's take COVID for an example. There was this sudden surge of need in terms of assistance to be provided. Governments had to intervene, and then there's an emergency purpose that needs to be put in place, which requires people to be helped at that moment. So that's where we are all talking about, right? That the $30 billion or the multi-billion dollar that every other country went through in terms of providing aid. So the governments actually have challenges getting these services or getting these subsidy programs to the members of the public. So in an online world, in a digital world, it doesn't actually cut it out by just going online and publishing the service, but then you don't allow people to apply for it. You don't have the mechanisms to quickly have them to subscribe to those services. Then that's the part of the visibility issue that we are trying to solve here. So if we can provide the governments with a tool, with a capability where with a click of a button, they are able to publish a scheme, and all the information that needs to go along with it is configurable. So they don't really have to go to the developers, program it. They don't have to have the wizards created to capture the information in terms of the data points that they need from the applicants. And most importantly, in a country like Singapore, where we don't really have to tell many things to the government about ourselves. The government actually knows quite a lot about us, our identity information, our economic status, and so on. So we are all talking about allowing people to apply for it. Why should people apply for it? Why can't the government determine automatically and then distribute this without me asking the government? So that is the next paradigm shift that we are trying to help governments achieve. And of course, there's a lot of emphasis on privacy, a lot of emphasis on security. So once you have a bundled package that we can take this forward. So that's in terms of the eligibility check and all that. So moving to the disbursement angle, most of the governments have two challenges that we have seen. One is the ability for them to be confident that the money that they are giving to people is being spent for the right reasons, what it is meant for. As I previously quoted, one of the Asian countries having challenges controlling the money that is being given to children to buy stationery, buy books, pay for their transport. But they also have challenges that children should not be misusing this money that is given to them. How do we control the spending that the government has given? So that's the controlling and the spending part. The second major problem is governments usually try to avoid or try to control this by issuing special purpose tokens, as we would call it, or it's a voucher, or it's a token, or it's some sort of a closed loop payment system that only works with people who have come into that network of accepting those type of payments. So if it's a voucher, then you need to look for a merchant who has a mechanism for them to accept the voucher for a service that they provide to the members of the public. And then they have a challenge of going back to the government and claiming that money from the government. So MasterCard comes into play where they have this vast network of payment terminals. They are able to use the classifications that they have about shops, about establishments, and they're able to put all this digitally in place with the click of a button. So those are some of the values that we think we can bring forward to the government with this partnership.
Good stuff. And as Eugene mentioned, the MasterCard network is already very mature and very robust. And of course, you guys have been doing this stuff for about 35 years now. So connecting those two environments, obviously, it does take some effort and some work. But I'm guessing that you obviously have a lot of expertise in that space. Can you talk at all about how you bring these two systems together? We got about a minute and a half before the break. Go ahead.
All right. So from a technology point of view, MasterCard is a well-matured company with a lot of emphasis on APIs, interoperability, and so on. They already have the products which are digital in nature that allows cross-border integration with other parts of the world and so on. So we have been developing products with the same thought process in mind, because our systems cannot work independently. Previously, from a traditional mindset, our systems have to integrate with other government organization systems through APIs and all that. So the fundamental linking between these two diverse products, which are required to be put together, are through APIs with definite interoperability standards, with PCI specifications, and so on. So that's how these two systems come together in terms of information exchange.
Yeah, that's pretty good stuff. And once again, folks, we're talking about how MasterCard is now in a partnership with CrimsonLogic, working with governments around the world, including Singapore, to really tie this all together. And anyone who has ever worked in government services knows there are lots of different systems. It can be very difficult to integrate all this stuff. So to have this marshaling area where you have an audit trail that's very clear, where you have reporting and analytics that you can run, it's very, very useful, and it saves money, it saves time, it saves quality, it ensures that the programs are doing what they're supposed to be doing. So there's really just a long list of benefits for having this kind of public-private partnership, and that's what you want to see. You want to see organizations working with the government transparently, building out these systems to where we can all see, and then the consumers can log in, the citizens can see what's going on, they can get their money easier, faster. That's all good stuff. Don't touch that dial, folks. We'll be right back. You're listening to Inside Analysis.
Recording stopped.
Good job. One down, 3 to go. That was the longest one. The next one's a little bit shorter. So where do you want to go next, Melvin? What do you want to talk about next?
The other part of this partnership is to enable cross-border payments, especially in the regulatory sector. There are several tools, several products available in the market that allows people to exchange monies or transfer monies from one place to the other. Western Union in a more traditional mindset, SWIFT and ACH and all that, which gives you interbank payment systems. But when it comes to regulatory payments, like for example, in case of trade, so a supplier in country A has to pay or has to be paid by a consumer who's in country B. So how do we enable this cross-border payments with this partnership that we are bringing? So CrimsonLogic, what we spoke about in the first part, is more of civic services, members of the public. The second part of the entire conversation is on the cross-border trade enablement.
Okay, that's interesting. All right, so I'll ask you a question about that when we chime in. We'll go for a few minutes, and then I'll throw it back over to Eugene to ask a couple questions.
One part of this is, how do you do something that's different. So I understand the SWIFT network fairly well, but it is owned by the banks. So it's a very closed system, but it's not closed enough. If you look at what's been going on with sanctions, implementation, and the fact that it was fairly easy to evade the sanctions in the Ukraine war. And it's interesting. It would be interesting to understand your perspective on how a different system with a different architecture and different membership could offer something to the marketplace that's a little bit more configurable, a little bit probably less costly, and offer more services.
Right.
Good. When are we back in, Eric?
28.
Okay.
So we got about a minute, 90 seconds. Yeah, I'll throw it over to you. Cross-border, I mean, that gets into all kinds of fun details. I remember learning, almost 20 years ago about the two-phase commit. Isn't that what they call it in banking, where the money goes from one place over here, and it's like, okay, I got it. And then you got to come back and tell this guy, okay, we got the money. Like, okay, good. Circuit closed, transaction done. Next.
The first thing that I started doing at Mellon Bank when I first started in banking was letters of credit. for international trade. Yep. Nostro vostro.
All right. Still got about 45 seconds or so. So you get quite a jump on your day.
Yeah, we're the cause of you getting up early, Melvin.
That's okay. Once in a while.
You can tell your office that you've been working for hours and hours and hours. By the time they're in it, I've already done my day's worth of work.
Well, that brings in flexibility.
Yeah. What's a normal office starting time in Singapore?
Most of the people start at 9 a.m. We close office by 6, around 6 p.m.
Okay, here we go. 5 seconds. Stand by.
See something? Say something.
Welcome back to Inside Analysis. Here's your host, Eric Kavanagh.
Take us to the future.
All right, folks, take us to the future indeed. Your host, Eric Kavanagh, here on Inside Analysis. We're talking today with Melvin Xavier of CrimsonLogic and Eugene Burke of Digital Strategies Group, all about payments, getting your money on time. I was talking earlier about my early days in the banking industry, and it used to take a while for a check to clear. It used to take 3 to 5 business days for a check to clear, and then it was 3 days, and then it was a couple days, and it's getting faster and faster. And now we have, of course, ACH transactions, and we have wire transfers, and all these things. And next up, we want to dive into international payments, paying from one country to another, because obviously you got all sorts of rules and regulations that come into play, and you want to be able to track that stuff, especially large amounts of money going from one country to another. You got to wonder about that. And then you have things like sanctions to be upheld and to worry about. Of course, we've got wars going on all over the planet right now, which is really unfortunate and quite tragic. And then a lot of times you get sanctions associated with bad behavior. So how do you enforce those sanctions? Well, we have the SWIFT banking network, but I do recall that in the beginning of the Ukraine war, there was all this talk about Russia just going off our system and saying, fine, the heck with you, I'll just do it some other way. And of course, they've got other countries going along with them. So that's another challenge. But I'll throw it over to Melvin to talk about this. Being able to handle cross-border payments, that's important stuff, because you've got to follow the rules and regulations of the target company or the target country and the source country, right?
Right. So when it comes to cross-border trade, there's been a lot of emphasis on moving information from one location to the other location. The whole idea of trade is to move goods, right? So from one location to the other location, it might be for manufacturing, it might be for consumption, or it might be for many other reasons like transshipment and so on. But what about the data that has to move along with this shipment? Traditionally, the data for shipments have been sent over through, in a very traditional sense, couriers or mails or Sometimes it's hand carried by people from one location to the other location if it's within the country. So CrimsonLogic has an advanced cross-border platform which allows traders across the world sitting in two different locations be able to share this information, transfer this information from the shipper to the receiver. So when it comes to moving cargo or goods from one country to the other country, the country where it is exported has certain regulations that you need to adhere to as a shipper. And as a consumer or as a receiver, the recipient country also has certain regulations in terms of import. And in between these two different characters, you have the transshipment countries, because cargoes just don't jump from one location and then land in the other location. It has to move through the sea route or through the air route, or maybe it is a land route if it's in Africa for that matter. And it has to go through multiple stop points or checkpoints. So along the way, there's an essential need for this information to be transferred. So we have perfected the capability to allow these traders to move this data from one location to the other location in an online world, and allow them to file this information into the destination country or get clearances from the source country, or then or at least get the in principle nod from the transshipment countries to allow this cargo to flow through. So that's from the cargo flow movement point of view. Then what happens to the money? The shipper needs to pay the receiver. The receiver needs to pay the duties for the government that they have to owe for the goods to be imported into the country. So there's a lot of money involved, but there's no automation as we see. People still use very traditional ways of paying using wire transfers, pay using account deposits. They probably have to have escrow accounts with the government where there's a bulk of amount that is blocked as a security. So there's a lot of trust gaps that has arisen out of this. And of course, we have the banking system. The bankers help with letters of credit and the trade financing part, but those are not linked back to this trade ecosystem. So what we are trying to do with Mastercard is, let's say a shipper wants to send a piece of cargo that's costing them about $100, and it needs to be sent from one country to the other, A to B. And at the recipient side, the receiver from the B has to pay the person A. And there's a lot of intertwining letters of credit, some sort of a guarantee. If you don't pay me after I receive, who's going to be held responsible? So we are trying to automate all this with the movement of the good. The entire process of releasing funds, releasing partial funds based on certain stages of the life cycle are all automated. And at both the sides, you need to have a payment partner. And so somebody has to pay someone, and it has to go through a payment system. So Mastercard nicely comes into play where they are able to automate this entire process with integrations that we have established with them from the trade system. So that largely kind of summarizes this entire ecosystem.
Yeah, and real quick, one thing I've noticed is that phones, mobile devices have a different profile and are treated very differently from laptops and desktop computers, et cetera. And you're seeing some real innovation in the insurance space. I think the company is Lemonade, maybe, where everything gets done. It's like for insurance for cars and things like this, and everything is done on the phone because, of course, you got geolocation data, you have the signature of the device itself. Does that play into your logic for security and for governance and kind of knowing who's who, being able to tell which phone it is, what version of the phone, what operating system, all that kind of stuff, that comes into play, right?
Right. So we do have a mobile first thought process in developing solutions, because people especially on the ground, like traders, shippers, freight forwarders have kind of started adopting and appreciating the use of mobile form factors. So the apps that we develop, the systems that we develop are mostly mobile first. So we make sure that it works in a mobile device. But that again comes with security, because we don't want somebody to take a mobile phone away and then use that for other purposes and so on. But lifting a big laptop or a computer from an office is going to be much more challenging than just lifting up a device that's like, a very small piece of device. So we do have a lot of telemetry data that we capture. The apps are secured by the trust protection modules that are available within the devices. So we leverage on Apple's or Google's capability to protect the apps that run within the devices from being accessed. So there's a lot of digital identity comes into play, where if there's a national authentication system provided by the local governments, that gets integrated with the systems. So what we are essentially talking is about the regulated space of usage, where governments have a strong emphasis on security, privacy, and compliance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm reminded of the key fob, right? The key fob comes along. Now I can unlock my car from a distance, and it was hailed as a security achievement or an innovation. But at the same time, if a bad guy gets your key fob, he or she can just walk around the parking lot clicking that thing till they find your car. So it's like something that seems to be helping security can actually hurt security. And of course, you guys have to think through all that stuff, right? Is all the different touch points, all the different checkpoints. And these days, I mean, security, maybe we could talk about that very quickly. Security is obviously very important when you're talking about payments going from place to place. A friend of mine is a developer, and he worked for Salesforce for a while in a very special group where they would deploy security artifacts into the system. And now you can kind of see this in websites. It takes a little bit longer to log into your bank. You know, sometimes you'll get like an extra step, like a captcha or something to get through. And the reason is because they're trying to keep this completely secure, airtight. Isn't that right, Melvin?
Yes, that is right. So in terms of security, there's few dimensions on how we can look at it. Transactional security, data security, and then comes the privacy part of it. How securely is the information about me kept by the system, whoever it could be? It could be Mastercard, it could be CrimsonLogic, or it could be the government themselves. So there are different. Over the last few years, the emphasis on security has kind of increased. There's a mainstream understanding on how information needs to be protected. So the governments all over the world are working very closely with partners like CrimsonLogic, like Mastercard, to put in place controls, put in place methods and mechanisms that protect the information of individuals, and it can be at the transactional level, as you rightly pointed out, stopping people from gaining access to certain systems on behalf of someone who should not by right happen. So that's where the biometric, the leverage on the biometric capabilities of today's mobile phones come into play. Of course, we don't have access to the biometric signature of the individuals, but we rely on people like Apple, people like Google to provide us with the validations that are necessarily in place. Then comes the server-side security. Then you have the communication security. That's where the CAPTCHA comes into play, and all the standards that we need to adhere to, the ISMS, the ISO 27001. They are very strict protocols, and a shift that we see in the area of privacy is every country has come up with their own privacy laws. And every country have their own privacy commission, data protection commission. And those commissions are largely sharing well-documented, concrete guidelines that are expected to be adopted, followed, complied to, and audited. So there's a lot of protocols that need to be done. And most of this learning is coming from the banking space, is coming from the military space, and governments are learning from each other and then trying to make things more stronger in terms of securing the information.
Yeah, and real quick before I hand it over to Eugene, one thing that really excites me about policy and the nexus of policy and artificial intelligence and systems design and management is that we're getting very close to, thanks to ChatGPT and some of these other AI engines, to be able to interpret policy, like written policy in different languages, and map that to code. We're not quite there yet, I think, but it's very close to being able to take a policy from a government and map that over to Python or C# or C++ or whatever the case may be. Are you folks playing around that stuff yet? And what do you think about that?
So there are two parts to it, enabling governments to use AI and also protecting governments and their systems from the misuse of AI. So it's quite easy for people to now go to ChatGPT or Bard and ask a specific question, and Bard and ChatGPT can give pretty much good answers to certain questions that probably people might take a few years for them to learn through self-reading, through self-teaching, and so on and so forth. So if, let's say, I want to write a piece of code to hack a system, and I can just go to ChatGPT and ask for it to generate the code, and it can just generate the code out of the blue, and then put it into a vulnerability, and then try to exploit the vulnerability that is there. So the vulnerability part of it is protected. So the defense mechanisms that are currently in place are also appreciating the use. So they are trying to play against the antagonists with the same capability the antagonist is trying to exploit the vulnerabilities that probably are there in the system. So that's from the security part of it. In terms of the usage of AI in public policy, usage of AI in government services, there's a lot of appreciation for the government to use AI to help them provide services to their subjects in a much faster, much efficient way. We do foresee the governments all over the world may not be at the right form, at the right shape, have difference of opinion in adopting AI. So there was this interesting conversation that I was having with one of the government organizations in the world about how justified is AI going to be in terms of determining who I need to serve. Would that be a prejudice? Would that be a bias? Would the AI programs be trained in the right manner to see the service delivery with the right optics and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of research, a lot of uncovering that needs to be done in the usage of AI, especially with public policy making. But we have seen a lot of headway being achieved already by certain governments.
Cool. Eugene, we only got 2 minutes left, but I'll let you take over the next segment. Take it away.
The area where a lot of innovation and there's frankly a need is personal data protection and protecting people's zone of privacy and how different that is in every country. And so in the next segment, I'd be really interested to see how, if you're doing cross-border payment processing, government to government, government contractor to government across the world, you're managing so many different privacy regimes. I'd be curious to see how you're approaching that.
Sure. In terms of privacy, as you have said, as we have discussed earlier, there are different regimes that usually governments try to apply to, and these regimes are kind of very similar, but they have their own nuances because of various variables that come into play in terms of culture, in terms of the fundamental constitution of the country. If they are more liberal, are they more capitalist, are they more democratic? So there are different dimensions that come into play into how governments look at privacy or personal data. So the Europeans have a different understanding and interpretation of privacy. The continental United States, Canada have their own version. Singapore has our own version. So when it comes to moving data across various systems, we rely on third-party partners like the cloud service providers. Most of the cloud service providers, even though they have this notion of cloud, they do have certain adherences that they need to comply to at a local level.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Let's pick that up after the break, folks. Fascinating conversation today with CrimsonLogic about a MasterCard partnership. We'll be right back. You're listening to Inside Analysis.
Recording stopped.
Good job. Well done. 2 down, 2 to go. You can see the hour goes by quickly. Yeah, this is, we can get into, you kind of just hinted at it, so I'll throw this back over to you when we start, and then Eugene, follow up with your questions. But you hinted at the shared responsibility model. Someone did once explain to me exactly what that is. Do you know exactly the line of demarcation between when it's my responsibility and when it's the cloud provider's responsibility?
Well, that is a contestable topic. Amazon, Azure, GCP have their own interpretations on where they want to draw a line as a tenant, as a subscriber to those services. I have my own interpretation on where the line has to be drawn. But from an enterprise point of view, from a government point of view, the rules, the regulations are quite clear. anything about the capability that the cloud provider provides, where the application or the system that is deployed being developed by another vendor. So there's a level of clarity that people have come into adopting from, especially the government and the enterprise side. It's probably in the consumer side, there's still some level of lack in clarity and in understanding. But governments pretty much are quite clear.
Yeah, well, basically, if it's in my environment, in other words, if somehow a virus gets into my environment, that's my fault. But if there's some penetration that happens at the infrastructure level, that's their fault, right? Isn't it basically the infrastructure is the line of demarcation?
Yes. The line where the runtime is, it could be I am using the cloud native capabilities like Beanstalk or whatever it is, or the Sure App Services. But essentially that's a runtime. So the runtime could be at a virtual level, at an operating system level, at a physical infrastructure level, or it could be just at a logical level. It could be as a platform or a software as a service that I'm trying to leverage on.
There was a relatively nasty breach on AWS with Capital One a couple years ago, when I was just finishing with Barclays. And it was because from one layer to the other, a highly privileged account had too many rights to go into a next layer. And one of the consultants was let go or something like that. She still had active creds, and Capital One nailed them to the wall. Wow. Because it was AWS's fault for for making it too easy to jump from layer to layer, because they hadn't really implemented what we would call zero trust now. And also having someone who is offboarded still having live creds. Capital One got them.
Wow.
Yeah. Yep.
Cool. All right, we got about 45 seconds left. So we'll come back about that, just kind of touch on that. It should probably get us all the way through till, again, we're out at 58:50. And then if you could stick around for 5 more minutes, we'll just kind of chat to do the podcast bonus segment.
No matter who we call family, when we choose to get the flu shot, we're protecting them. That's especially
That's my suggestion. My mother-in-law got the flu shot, and like 2 days later, she got Bell's palsy. She's had it ever since.
Oh,
yeah, man. It's not so good. I mean, you can't for sure connect the two, but I'm pretty sure.
Learn more at heart.org/flu.
Welcome back to Inside Analysis. Here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
Analysis talking to Melvin Xavier from CrimsonLogic and Eugene Burke from Digital Strategies Group, talking all about this partnership between CrimsonLogic and Mastercard, making it easier to pay the piper, as I say, but not just pay the piper, really also do analysis, do reporting, business intelligence, all that fun stuff, have an audit trail, and be able to really manage the numbers and understand, is the money going to the right people? And I sadly referenced the $30 billion that's estimated that California lost to fraud during the COVID relief programs. And that's just embarrassing beyond belief. And they were cross-border, too. There are people in Africa somehow scamming the system in California. It's like, what kind of system did you put in place that you can't tell you're being connected to from some other nation moving money across the planet? I mean, that's just beyond belief. I think it's beyond reproach. But Melvin, you hinted at this whole concept of shared responsibility, which refers to, in the cloud computing environment, when some breach or virus is the fault of the cloud computing company like Amazon or Microsoft or Google, and when it's the fault of the tenant who is in that environment. And typically the line drawn, as I understand it, is that if I have a virus in one of my systems that I allowed to get in through some mistake or some hole in my security, that's my fault. But if there's something on the infrastructure side that allowed this breach to happen or that caused me some trouble, then it's the cloud provider's fault. But the bottom line is cloud providers are really big, and a lot of companies are pretty small compared to that. So, Eugene had a great story about Capital One fighting them and winning, but Capital One is a big company, right? So what are your thoughts on the shared responsibility, and where do you draw that line?
All right. So when it comes to the government space or the public service space, most of the governments have very strict policies that they have put in place with the adoption of cloud infrastructure. So again, as you have said, from a small company to a big company, Capital One being able to sue the CSPs, it also kind of applies to the size of the country. So if you're looking at smaller countries in the Pacific, in the Caribbean, or in the oceanic regions, they may not have the muscle to go up against such big service providers. So they are very conservative in nature. So they don't really appreciate the use of cloud. They try to host the systems within their own in-house data centers. So there's this version of public cloud, private cloud, and so on and so forth. Countries like the US, Europe, Singapore have demanded the CSPs to carve out their entire cloud infrastructure to be locally placed and with controls in place. So for example, for that matter, in Singapore, there's a version of AWS, GCP, and Azure that is available for the Singapore government organizations to subscribe to. So that's what we call it as the government commercial cloud. Now, the government commercial cloud has very strict controls that are put in place that are very specific to Singapore. So as I previously said in the previous segment about the culture, the different variables that come into the interpretation of privacy, interpretation of security is kind of taken into consideration when the CSPs are asked to have the data reside within the country and its own terms, the country's terms, and the country's security requirements. So then the next thing comes. This is from the prevention point of view. What happens after the event has occurred when there's a vulnerability exploited or whatever it is? That's where the investigation comes into play. The common understanding that we have in the market is if my application that runs in a cloud environment, and if I leverage on a runtime that is provided by the cloud environment, it could be at a virtual level, it could be at the application logical level, it could be at any level. And if my application has resulted in the vulnerability to be exposed to the internet or to the exploitation, and so I take responsibility for it. So it's very clear. Thanks to many of the incidents that have happened over the last many years with the cloud service providers, there's a common understanding that is kind of coming to some level of maturity for professionals to treat each other professionally and then have some sort of mitigation plan in place to protect those issues from happening. So that's how I see things are being done in this area.
Yeah, it helps to have policy. I'll throw this over to Eugene, to have policy and then to be able to demonstrate to auditors and regulators and government entities and your colleagues how that policy is implemented. And as long as you have something like that in place, you should be pretty well off. But what do you think, Eugene?
Yeah, so Singapore has a well-earned reputation of because of its history, having an extraordinarily well-run government. And that is not the case around its own region, and it's certainly not the case in other parts of the world. And having the Singaporean perspective on how do we roll out government payment schemes in the good sense of the word scheme, because it shouldn't be boiling the ocean every time, is it's an interesting market offering because it shouldn't require reinventing the wheel every time, because there should be a fairly well understood recipe that we can just execute. And it's a welcome thought, because if you pair what Crimson can do with its system security and understanding cross-border payments with the reach and breadth of MasterCard, you've got something pretty interesting.
Yeah, what do you think about that, Xavier or Melvin? I'll throw it over to you.
All right. I mean, that's a very good perspective that Eugene has brought up. So it's a recipe, right? So you have a recipe to cook something, and the contextualizing or the localizing part of it is more of the ingredients that go into the recipe. The recipe largely remains the same, but where we have seen the recipe needs customization or needs localization that we have done in other parts of the world. So we do have projects in the Latin American region, Caribbean, closer to the continental United States. We do have cross-border facilitation that we do between the US and Canada. But if we take the recipe that is identical to what we have done in Singapore or in other parts of the world to that part of the world, it doesn't really work. So there's a lot of customization that we need to do, but the recipe largely remains the same. So understanding from the best practices that we have, I mean, Singapore has one of the best digital ID platforms in the world. We were the pioneers in rolling out one of the world's first filing systems, one of the world's first trade facilitation platforms. So a lot of such systems are in use today across the world, taking reference to taking the learnings from what we have done in Singapore. If you take the case in point, CrimsonLogic, we have been quite successful in tailoring the recipe that we have created in Singapore for many of our Singapore public government organizations or public service organizations to other parts of the world, be it in the developing part as well as in the developed part of the geography.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's good stuff. And maybe for the podcast bonus segment, we'll dig deeper into trade, because you talk about this even in your tagline, right? Simpler trade, smarter tech. Trade gets very complicated. You have all sorts of bill of goods. You've got ERP systems that have to come into place to be able to manage all this supply chain stuff. Of course, we saw post-COVID and even pre-COVID, quite frankly, in the last administration here in the U.S., we had these levies and tariffs placed on goods from China. So we had some advanced warning that there was going to be some disruption to supply chains. And you folks are pretty strong in that area as well, hence your focus on trade, right? You have to understand bill of materials and supply chains and going back and forth between these systems. That is pretty complex stuff. Just talk very quickly about that.
All right. So CrimsonLogic has its genesis from building the world's first trade facilitation system, and that was in Singapore.
Wow.
So, I mean, this is something that the likes of United Nations, World Bank have given us that credit of having done so. So when it comes to cross-border movement of data, and as a company who's majorly owned by one of the world's largest port operators, PSA, PSA operates the Singapore port. Likewise, they operate large ports in Europe, in the US, and so on. So our focus has been pretty much aligned with our primary shareholder on digitalizing and digitally transforming the trade area of the business. So there are two parts to the trade business. One is the merchant to merchant, supplier to supplier. We call that as a B2B, the business to business segment of the complexities that arise out of information sharing between the ERP systems. And you have market players like SAP, Ariba, Salesforce, and all of the likes who provide some level of facilitation of organizations to work between each other, where there are invoice systems that are in place, there's a PPOS standard, and so on and so forth. But when it comes to the government, there's a lot of lack in terms of intra-government operability, which is where companies like CrimsonLogic come into play. We facilitate the movement of data between the private people who are on the private space, their ERP systems, integrate them with a mediator or a middleman like CrimsonLogic, and then we take this data to the government. So we have around 70 nodes across the world. We directly integrate with the government systems to push the data in.
Yeah, that's great stuff. Well, folks, we'll dive more in the podcast bonus segment into all that. But what a fascinating conversation today with Melvin Xavier from CrimsonLogic and, of course, Eugene Burke of Digital Strategies Group.
Recording stopped.
All right. Thanks a lot, Ben. That was great. All right. If you guys want to just go for like 5 quick minutes, stand by. I'll pull the.
Sure.
Here we go.